Live. Welcome everybody to another episode of The Professor and the Idiot. I'm Nick Wolfinger.
And I am Dalton Whitehead.
And this week we are very happy to have on our show a legend of journalism and social media, Cathy Young. Cathy is a regular columnist for Newsday and Real Clear Politics and a frequent contributor to Reason, Quillette, Art Digital, and many other outlets, as well as the author of 2 books. She's a very prolific writer. Cathy's a native of the USSR and immigrated to the United States in 1980. A lot of her recent writing is concerned with gender in one way or another. And so there are many different things, Dalton, that I would love to talk to you about. We are both interested in the USSR. I've read a lot about it. I'm currently reading Eugenia Ginsburg's memoir of the Gulag, Into the Whirlwind.
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful book.
Yes.
And hello, by the way, before we go on to this, I will just say, thank you for having me on the podcast. I've talked to Nick a lot on Twitter, so we kind of go way back. This is the first time I'm meeting Dalton, but yeah, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And
yes, thank you.
We're excited that we have a real live libertarian for him to talk to.
An educated libertarian.
Okay, so do you want me to, are we going to have to redo this because of my phone?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Don't even worry about it.
Okay.
The two of you can gang up on me. And we're also really interested in campus sexual politics and Title IX, so we have tons to talk about. So,
okay.
With that in mind, is there anything you want to talk about, Cathy? Dalton, do you have any questions you want to start with?
Oh, my goodness, I will just take the lead from you guys. You're the hosts, I'm the guest, so, I assume that you know what you want to talk about.
Right off the bat, just the USSR.
Okay.
Reasons for leaving, where did you go after, I'd love to hear that whole story.
Okay, well, if you want to start with that, I'll be happy to kind of give you the backstory. Shall we?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so I was, and this is, by the way, something that I talk about in my first book, Growing Up in Moscow, which came out in 1989. I was born in Moscow in a sort of educated Russian Jewish family. My family left, with a reason for leaving, basically. I usually answer that question with, when people have asked me, well, why did you leave? My kind of go-to answer is because we could,
Oh, yeah.
At the time, it's really interesting because we left in 1980. And honestly, if somebody had told me at the time that, 11 years later, the USSR would cease to exist, it just would have sounded like a total joke. Because it really seemed like this was forever. It was this totalitarian system where, there was just this complete lack of freedom. And I was raised in a family where both of my parents were sort of closet dissidents, basically. I didn't, unlike a lot of Soviet children, I didn't go to, I wasn't in daycare, so I wasn't really exposed to the sort of Soviet training as a preschooler. And I was extremely sort of ignorant about all things political. I didn't, there's a there's a story that's kind of infamous in my family where I think when I was maybe 5 years old, my grandmother went into a store with me, and I think it was a bookstore or something. Anyway, there was on one of the shelves, there was a bust of Lenin, And I was so like out of it that I had no idea who Lenin was. I had never seen any pictures of Lenin. I mean, I kind of grew up very sheltered and, in my family. I was never given any sort of propaganda books, which most other kids by that age had been exposed to. And I looked at this bust of Lenin and I said very loudly, "Grandma, who is that funny guy and what's he doing up there?" And she was like, no, let's get out of here quickly. And then when I was 7, I went to school, and suddenly I was coming home and saying things like, "Oh, I think we're very fortunate to be living in the Soviet Union and not in a capitalist country where, life would be really terrible." And then my dad, mostly my dad, but also my mom to some extent, started kind of educating me about, what was what, and about the fact that, well, this really is not necessarily the best system in the world. And I remember very well, my mom telling me when I was maybe like 8 years old, "Please remember that you should never talk at school about what your dad tells you at home, because otherwise, we're going to be in trouble." And so I definitely, by the time I was 10, I sort of had this very clear sense of the sort of dual existence where on the one hand, there was the kind of official party line in school where, we wrote essays about Lenin and, everybody joined the Young Pioneers and, there were all these songs about the red Soviet banner and how it stood for the right cause of the workers and, et cetera. And then on the other hand, there were the things I heard at home about, among other things, the fact that my dad's parents were prisoners in the Gulag when my dad was growing up. And they survived, unlike many other people. But anyway, that was one of the things I heard about. I certainly had an awareness of the fact that, in fact, life was definitely better in other countries. Eventually, I was reading sort of samizdat books.
Tell Dalton what samizdat is.
So yeah, and then in 1980, my family left the country. At that time, there was a kind of limited amount of immigration permitted. Officially, we were going to Israel, where my dad's aunt and some other relatives were living. Like everybody else who immigrated, we were eventually given a choice, once we were in Vienna, of going either to Israel or to the United States. We had always wanted to go to the United States, so, here I am.
Tell Dalton what samizdat is.
Oh, samizdat was basically like self-published literature. It was essentially... this is, of course, all totally pre-computers, so it was things that were, typed on a typewriter, and usually it was sort of barely legible, third, fourth, and fifth copies, all, carbon copies. This is all extremely sort of dinosaur technology we're talking about. But yeah, there was that, and there were also books that had been published abroad and were smuggled in. And, those were also like things that I quite distinctly remembered being in our house. The Gulag Archipelago, which I read parts of when I was maybe 12, 13 years old. My parents listened to foreign radio broadcasts, Radio Liberty, Voice of America. So yeah, I mean, I was... by the time I was a teenager, I was definitely quite politically aware, and very much a sort of aspiring dissident, basically. So that's my story.
What was your standard of living in Moscow as a child of educated parents?
It's really hard to to kind of compare to today's living standards partly because, of course, technology is also very different, everywhere. But, this was the 1970s. By Soviet standards, my family actually, in many ways, had a pretty decent life because, if only because, unlike many other people, we did not live in a communal apartment, because many people, I don't know about the exact numbers, but at the time there were still a lot of people in the Soviet Union who basically shared an apartment with at least one other family. When my mother was growing up in the 1930s, I think that they shared an apartment with something like 4 other families, all of them sharing the same kitchen and bathroom. In my dad's case, I think it was even worse than that. And of course, in my time growing up, we actually did have a kind of regular bathroom with a shower. That was something that, in my parents' generation, mostly when you wanted to have a bath, you went to the public bathhouse. So in that sense, obviously, compared again to my parents' generation, and of course they also lived through the war when, people were going hungry a lot of the time. In my time, there were certainly food shortages. It wasn't, at least in Moscow, it was really not about, people going hungry, but there was a lot of standing in line. Things like, fresh fruit was, generally speaking, pretty difficult to get. Bananas were something that were kind of a rare treat. And I was, not very long ago, I was saying to my mom, could you have ever imagined when we were living in the Soviet Union that, we would have bananas and throw them out because they were overripe? That would have been something completely unimaginable. I remember from an early age, my mom would take me shopping and would sometimes leave me in line so that she could go and stand in another line somewhere else. And, that was just something that was, again, part of regular life. It was much better than in a lot of towns in the provinces. People from small towns would regularly travel to Moscow to do their food shopping, or, they didn't, for them, standing in line wasn't just, you stand in line for, let's say, 40 minutes, which in Moscow could be, pretty typical. Over there, it would be more like you had to line up for food at 6 a.m. if you wanted to get anything at all.
It's unbelievably fucked up.
Oh, of course. And
a telephone?
We had a telephone. It was a party line where basically we shared a phone line with the neighbors upstairs, one floor up. We couldn't hear each other's conversations, but if they talked on the phone, we couldn't use our line, and vice versa. So there was always the sort of issue of, if you had a long phone conversation, you might end up having your neighbors bang on your door going get off the phone, we need to make a phone call. That was, but again, we did at least have a phone. When my parents were young, for a pretty long time, they lived without a phone. If you were expected at a family dinner and you had to cancel, you couldn't even call and let them know. And, it was, again, for me in my generation and living in Moscow, it was a lot easier. I certainly can't really complain, again, compared to how the majority of people in the Soviet Union were living. I'm sure I was much, much better off. So I'm really not claiming a mantle of victimhood in that respect.
No. Let me tell you a joke, because you're one of the few people who will appreciate this. I think I learned it from maybe reading Conquest.
Okay.
So at the Gum department store in Moscow, there's news that there'll be a rare sale of shoes, that there'll be a shipment. And so well before dawn, people are lining up. There's a huge line. 2 hours before they're supposed to open, the manager comes out and says, we're having trouble finding enough staff, so we're going to have to ask all the Jews to leave and go home. So a few people get out of the line.
All right, I remember the joke, yeah.
An hour before they're supposed to open, they said, we're having trouble with inventory control. And so we're still going to open, but we're going to have to ask all the Ukrainians to leave. A few more people get out of line. The opening hour comes about. Nothing happens. An hour later, they say we're having trouble getting the cash register set up. We're going to have to ask all the Latvians to leave. A few more people get out of line. So this goes on all day until finally the employees of the store say, we're not opening today. And the few remaining people in line, you start grumbling and get ready to leave. And one says to the other, those Jews, they always get the best of everything.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I know a somewhat different version of that, but yeah, it's like the same thing.
Does that capture the reality?
I mean, certainly not. Well, it doesn't capture the reality in that they really wouldn't like openly say all the Jews have to leave. Right. But I mean, the reality is more like I mean, my mom tells me the story where she I mean, one of the things that were really kind of in short supply were any sort of like reasonably fashionable, sort of reasonably stylish, clothes and accessories and so on. Like, if you wanted a handbag that, it doesn't just look like a couple of pieces of, leather sewn, crudely sewn together, that was pretty hard to get. Like if you wanted something a little more like stylish, fashionable, etc. And so, my mom, who had like this really old handbag that looked like it was going to fall apart, she was in, probably, I don't know if it was GUM or some other department store, but, like she sees this long line and she asks, what's being sold, and they said, it's these handbags that are apparently made from like a foreign license. So they were like apparently these kind of fashionable looking handbags. And my mom thought, well, it's a really terribly long line, but oh well, I'll give it a try. Maybe I'll actually manage to get it. So she gets in line. And after she stands in line for about, I don't know, an hour maybe, the manager comes out and says, comrades, we're out of handbags. This is it. There are no more handbags. Go home. And nobody moves. Everybody just keeps standing there. And my mom left. I mean, my mom was not crazy like the other people, but the other people just continued to stand there. And she was like, I don't even know what they're waiting for, but, they're still standing there. And I mean, my mom had several of these stories. Like there was another time when she wasn't even standing in line, and she was almost crushed because she kind of got caught in a crunch when, they announced that they had just started selling something that, people wanted, and everybody just stampeded toward, wherever that was. And she pretty much like got caught in the stampede, almost got knocked off her feet. I mean, I remember that when I was a teenager, and of course, when you're a teenager, you're very self-conscious about your appearance, of course, especially if you're a girl, obviously, and there are fashion standards. And I didn't have the winter. I had these felt winter boots that people at school were actually teasing me about, and I remember somebody saying, ew, like only grandmothers wear boots like these. And I came home very upset. I was like 14, and I told my mom about it, and she was really pissed off, and she actually wanted to go and talk to the principal, and I said, no, please don't. I really don't want this to go any further. But anyway, so one time my mom and I went shopping, and there was a local store that was supposed to be the sort of high quality store that was that there was a kind of supermarket on the lower level, and there was a department store on the upper level. So we went there, and there was this line that kind of snaked around the entire building. I mean, I don't really know how long it would have actually taken to get to the end of that line. And, my mom asked what was being sold, and it was these check winter boots that, they had on display, and they actually looked very nice. And my mom looked at me and she said, so, well, if you want nice winter boots, I suppose we could actually get on this line, and, it's up to you. And I looked at that line and I said, nah, I really don't want them that badly. I mean, if they want to give me a hard time at school about my felt boots, whatever, I'm really not getting on this line. So, yeah, it was stuff like that. And I mean, I went to a school which was kind of an elite school in that, I guess it was maybe a little bit like the charter schools that we have here, where they had kind of admission by exam only. Like not everybody could get in. You had to pass when you were 7 years old. You had to pass a test showing a certain level of proficiency in reading, writing, arithmetic, and so on. And so it was kind of a higher quality school. And we had a number of kids who came from kind of elite families, like not the very, very elite, but like we had a couple of girls whose parents were diplomats who, lived abroad part of the time. So they had nice stuff, and then of course everybody was completely entranced with anything that was foreign, so, and it was interesting because like for all the kind of contempt that was displayed for the consumerist West, the level of materialism was actually huge. I mean, like anything that was kind of above the general standard was just so incredibly coveted, and and it was and there it was definitely. I mean, there was a lot of status consciousness, and it was funny because everybody wore uniforms. They definitely had school uniforms, and they were pretty strict about enforcing them. But because people couldn't kind of wear clothes, like different clothes to show off status, the status displays were generally through things like boots and winter coats. So, but it was still, I mean, definitely there was a lot of status display via clothes. And of course, anytime there was a school party, where people could come wearing, different clothing, that was those were also opportunities for like showing off the nice stuff you had. So it was really quite materialistic in that regard. But yeah, it was and obviously a lot of the things I think are probably universal, like the sort of status competition among teenagers. Obviously, again, it took different forms. So yeah, I mean, I think some of the stuff that I, like some of the stuff in my book, even like people have told me that, anyone can really relate to this because it's really just general stuff of being a teenager. But of course, again, there were these very kind of Soviet specifics, and also in my case, I really did feel that I was sort of a closet dissident, and of course, a lot of people at school told political jokes and everything. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were, seriously critical of the system. And in my case, I really felt that when we had to write, let's say, essays about Lenin, I really felt that, for me, that was kind of living a lie, essentially. And that was definitely something that I really chafed at. And so in that sense, I was really extremely grateful when we emigrated. And in terms of present day Russia, I mean, I'm sometimes asked, would I have wanted to leave if I was living in present day Russia, where for all the problems, it's really not the same, ideologically. And I mean, I have a lot of issues with, obviously, with Vladimir Putin's Russia. I think there are many, many, very disturbing tendencies. There's definitely a degree to which, there's the powers that be sort of still wanted to be an ideologically uniform society. It's just that today, instead of communism, there's a kind of amalgam of Russian nationalism plus, Orthodox Christianity. And of course, anyone obviously, Jewish would kind of that you're in some ways you would be sort of on the outside of that. Although, there's certainly a level of acceptance of being openly Jewish that didn't exist at the time that I was living.
That definitely strikes me as
Jewish
true.
Community. There are openly existing Jewish community organizations. So yeah, I mean that's in many ways. It really has changed for the better. I mean, I would certainly not dispute that.
I've been to Russia about 10 years ago, and I've been to Castro's Cuba, and I could see the huge difference between the two.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I have not been to Cuba, but I can imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, in Russia today, I think there's a lot of pressure to kind of conform to the sort of dominant ideology. But unless you're very actively involved in opposition activism, and unless you're really you really pose a danger in some way to the regime, they're probably not going to do anything to you. Yeah.
Dalton said you're too nice and he's too polite to interrupt you, but he just texted me a question for me to ask you, which
and feel free to say at any time, because
I'm saying these stage directions out loud to embarrass him, so he asked the question himself the next time. He wanted me to ask you if you think taxation is theft, coming from a libertarian perspective.
Well, I'm not really a doctrinaire libertarian, so no, I don't think taxation is theft.
No.
I mean, I hate to disappoint if you were expecting me to sort of deliver the libertarian party line. No, I mean, I think that certainly there are levels of taxation that I would say, would amount to theft. I think that, taxation without representation is theft. I would say that as long as you're living in, human society and enjoying certain benefits of, living in that society, we all drive on the roads, we all, enjoy the protection of law enforcement, hopefully. I think that there's a productive debate to be had, obviously, about the levels of taxation. But no, I do think that, I believe in limited government, but certainly I can't see how any kind of government could exist without the power of taxation to some extent.
What about?
Oh, go on.
What about voluntary taxes? Why does it have to be taken by force?
Well, that is okay. That's an interesting question, and I think one argument that I've seen that I think is an interesting argument is that there are situations in which if there is a strong social consensus that you need to like give your money towards something, that like the vast majority of people will follow that consensus and give the money. And I think one interesting example that I've seen used for that is tipping, where tipping is entirely voluntary, but like I don't know what the exact stats are, but the vast majority of people do tip when they eat at a restaurant. So I think that there can be an interesting argument made for voluntary taxation, sure, but ultimately, I guess you also do kind of run into the freeloader problem, because you can't really say, well, unless you contribute to this or that government program, you're not going to be kind of allowed to enjoy the benefits of it. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, but again, I mean, I'm really not here as a kind of representative of the libertarian viewpoint or anything. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, I guess I've called myself a libertarian because it comes kind of closest to my views in terms of limited government and personal freedom and economic freedom. But I mean, I'm probably sort of on a pretty moderate point of the libertarian scale. So, is there such a thing as a libertarian centrist? Because, if there is, I guess I would be a libertarian centrist.
Yeah, I mean, we typically speak of left libertarians and right libertarians, but I don't see why, if that scale exists, there can't be libertarian centrists.
Yeah, so that would be me. One of these days, I'm probably going to write I should do an AMA or something, where I can sort of explain my views on various issues, because I mean, I think my opinions are pretty kind of idiosyncratic. So,
what did you think of Ron Paul?
Oh my goodness! Don't get me started. I am really not a Ron Paul fan.
Oh no!
Oh
no! He's the man.
He's a racist.
He's a racist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I don't know. Like, I don't know what his personal views are on race, but I mean, I think certainly the whole incident with those newsletters that had some really disturbing racist stuff. To me, I mean, I know that his claim was that he didn't really put those out, but I think that when you have a newsletter coming out under your name and it's full of racist stuff, I don't know. I mean, I think that's seriously compromising. But honestly, though, my biggest issue with Ron Paul, I mean, I can understand the sort of the anti-interventionist argument, but
me too.
I'm sorry?
Oh, me too. Yeah. I mean, yeah,
right.
Yeah, no.
I mean, Ron Paul to me is someone who, I mean, the thing that's really fascinating to me is that, like, Ron Paul's arguments against kind of like the American empire really crossed the line into where I can barely tell the difference between, like Ron Paul and the communists, essentially, because it's like, I remember reading some of Ron Paul's stuff and thinking, oh my goodness, like, I think I read all of this in Pravda when I was growing up. Seriously.
Oh, Ron Paul's a communist. Who would have thunk?
Well, seriously though, I mean, I'm not saying that he's a communist, but I think that in terms of like his arguments about American imperialism, I think are really, like barely distinguishable from, what I remember of Soviet propaganda. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think that when you, when your critique of like American interventionism gets to the point where I'm trying to be careful here because I really don't want to be like, bashing anti-interventionists. But I mean, Ron Paul is somebody who, comes across to me as saying that the regime in Iran is really kind of like, they're basically fine people. I think there's a certain brand of anti-interventionist that essentially kind of sides reflexively with anyone on the international scene who's anti-American, and to me, Ron Paul really does kind of cross over into that category. So, that's I know that probably sounds harsh, but I stand by that.
I mean, I certainly could see the appeal after all of Bush's wars and mass incarceration and punishing marijuana users. I mean, is that why you became a fan, Dalton?
Yeah, he's
Right.
he's anti-war and anti-locking people in cages for nonviolent crimes.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I'm totally pro-legalization of marijuana. I think it's great that we're moving in that direction. I think, like, the mass incarceration argument, I think that's a kind of interesting topic because I think a lot of the time, like, and I understand that it's a problem, but I think a lot of the discussions that we're having right now tend to overlook the fact that mass incarceration happened in response to years of very, very high crime rates, and the pressure for stronger, for longer prison terms. Ironically, a lot of that came from African American lawmakers, and it's interesting because one person who recently discussed that, I don't know if you saw the interview with Paul Coates, who's the father of Ta-Nehisi Coates. That was fascinating. That was in, there's a Huffington Post publication called Highline, which is kind of like they do these in-depth things. And they ran an interview with Paul Coates, who actually used to be a part of the Black Panthers movement, which is, so like he's a guy with a really radical history. And he was talking about how, in a lot of the discussions of mass incarceration, Hillary Clinton caught a lot of flack over like her part in the 1994 crime bill. And the thing that people don't really talk about is that, to a very large extent, she was kind of pandering to, at the time, to a primarily Black constituency, because there were a lot of people in the African American community. There were, again, Charlie Rangel. A lot of these people at the time were pushing for longer sentences. They were pushing for fairly draconian drug laws because they felt that their communities were being devastated by crime and drugs. And of course, that I think a lot of that has backfired. We certainly have. I think everyone would agree today that we have excessive incarceration. Certainly, I think I'm glad to see that there's, extensive support for marijuana legalization. And I think certainly we should be rethinking some of the other legislation that has led to, incredibly long sentences for sometimes minor crimes. But at the same time, I mean, I think that we would do well to remember that, these things didn't just happen because we, decided that we need to just lock up more people, or because we decided that, we need to lock up more Black people, or, I think, again, this happened in response to very high crime rates. And I think a lot of people today, especially young people, don't remember what it was like to live in the midst of these very high crime rates. I mean, I kind of caught the tail end of it, but I was, I had a job in New York in the early 1990s, and I remember that, I was, the office where I worked was about 4 blocks away from Penn Station. And honestly, like when I was working late, it was a pretty scary walk.
I'm about your age, Cathy, and I remember visiting New York a lot in the 70s and 80s.
So yeah, I mean, I think that again, I think there's certainly a lot of very justified criticism of, things like mass incarceration, things like, the militarization of law enforcement. I think all of these are things that are targets of legitimate criticism. But again, I mean, I think that we need to remember that this was not like the product of human malevolence or, the product of, racist capitalist, oppressors wanting to lock people up. I think, it was a response in some ways misguided, to a very complicated situation. I mean, I think obviously, I think that a lot of the things that are being proposed today to kind of address this issue and to scale it down, I think are good. I mean, I don't agree with people like, Heather McDonald, who really believes that, if we scale down some of this very aggressive policing and if we, curb things like stop and frisk, we're going to see skyrocketing crime rates again. That doesn't seem to have happened. But again, I mean, I think that we need to remember that a lot of these issues really represent a kind of balancing act.
That sounds like the libertarian position, Cathy, about wanting less aggressive policing and no stop and frisk, just having a less involved police force. That sounds libertarian.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't say that. No, I'm not, but I would say that that's libertarian centrist. I mean, apparently, I'm not, I know that there's some libertarians who basically, advocate kind of non-state, really kind of private police forces, which to me really does not sound like a good idea. I mean, that to me sounds more like a prescription for, I don't know, like clashing vigilante squads or something.
That doesn't sound like a good idea to me, too.
Well, yeah, maybe just private security.
I'm in favor of like the libertarian viewpoint insofar as it means kind of scaling down government, limiting the powers of government, but, does that mean that we should, I guess it's really all a matter of degree. There is a certain point at which I think libertarianism kind of crosses over into anarchism, and that's something where I've not been bored. I think that there are some libertarians who tend to kind of interpret a lot of kind of like pro-policing actions, let's say, or, the pro-policing position as kind of purely coercive and purely, dictated purely by, like wanting to push people around and, by desire for power. And I think we have to look at people's motives. I think we have to understand that some of these issues really are complicated and that some of these, some of the push for more government comes from, wanting to accomplish positive things. Whether you're going about them in the right way is a totally, different question. But I really, I think there's a general tendency kind of across the board politically to presume malevolence on the other side, and that is something that I really wish, people wouldn't do so much. Obviously sometimes it's accurate. Sometimes I think we really have to kind of, take people at their word in terms of, what they really believe and why they believe it. I mean, people may have very misguided ideas, but nonetheless motivated by, wanting to accomplish something positive. And I think we could get much further, I think, if we acknowledge that.
So you said you want a limited government. Can you talk about anything in particular where you'd want the government to step back?
Sure. I think that, okay, you're kind of putting me on the spot here because I didn't expect that question. So, I think that one area where I think, can I sort of turn that question around a little bit and give you an example of, where I think we see people on both kind of the conservative and the liberal side wanting to use the government for their purposes, and that is speech regulation. Where, on the one hand, we're seeing some people on the progressive side pushing for hate crime laws, and I think we've seen, in other countries that don't have a First Amendment, we've seen in England, for instance, that hate crime laws are being used to, essentially suppress ideas that some people consider to be hateful. There's a kind of ongoing debate, for instance, about transgender issues, and it's an enormously complicated issue. And, I think we're still kind of figuring out a lot of things about gender identity. And then in England, we have seen people, getting arrested or, at least getting questioned by the police for hate speech for posting something on Facebook, questioning, for instance, whether an anatomically male person who identifies as a woman should be considered a woman. So, I think we've certainly seen that, again, hate crime laws can be misused quite egregiously. On the other hand, we also have conservatives here in the United States right now calling for regulation of social media platforms because they feel that, conservatives are kind of getting a raw deal on Twitter and Facebook, and, people are being unfairly banned. Which, even if it's the case, I really just don't see how the government should have any role in this, because these are privately owned social media platforms. We can certainly criticize them as consumers. If we feel that they're not abiding by their terms of service, we can certainly, pressure them to do better. We can say, we're going to leave the social media platform if people get banned for no justifiable reason. But really, for conservatives to essentially invite the government to step in and regulate, and to say that, we're going to force you to host, as a private corporation, we are going to force you to host speech that you disagree with. That seems to me, this is where I think limited government definitely comes in, because, thankfully we do have a First Amendment, and one of the things that it protects is freedom of association, which means that, if you're the CEO of Facebook and you decide, for instance, that you do not want to allow, white supremacists to have a presence on your platform, that's really entirely up to you. So, I think there is a lot of kind of hypocrisy on both sides where, everybody wants limited government when it favors their side. And then, everybody, and I think, I do think that this is an area where I think libertarians are definitely the most consistent.
I agree with that. Broadly.
Yeah, and listen, this doesn't mean that obviously that libertarians are always right about everything, but
Well,
I think that they are really admirably consistent in this regard, where they really, I mean, when they say they don't want the government to weigh in on, either one or the other side, I think they really mean it.
What were you going to say, Dalton?
it's never been truly tried.
What happened?
That is
True libertarianism.
Sure it has. Somalia.
Nah, they don't. They don't know what's going on.
They have limited government.
That's anarchism. That's more like non-existent government.
Yeah, it's libertarianism.
I'm gonna do research on Somalia so I can crush your argument.
Yeah,
Nick.
I think again, unless you're confusing libertarianism with anarchism, no, I mean, I think that if we're I think it depends very much on what you mean by libertarianism, and I think this is where there are probably as many definitions as there are libertarians. I mean, it's kind of like the joke about if you get like 5 Jews in a room, that means you're going to have like 8 different opinions on any given issues. It's really the same with libertarians. I think you put 5 libertarians in a room and you're going to get like maybe not even 8, like 15 different opinions on any given issue. So, there is no standard libertarian doctrine, I think, on a lot of these things. But there's, I think that for most libertarians, I think rule of law really is essential, which means that Somalia certainly isn't it.
Yeah, right.
Nope, definitely not.
According to the internet, their average IQ is like 68, so maybe that's why.
According to the internet.
According to the internet.
Well, the internet is, of course, right about everything. So.
Yeah.
It is.
That's the final word, and no additional discussion of any kind will ever need to be held on that point, ever.
Hey, I figured I'd try and come back with some humor or something.
All right, this is going downhill fast, so it's probably about the right time to wrap it up. And Cathy said,
I suppose we can do that, but gosh, we haven't even really started to cover gender issues.
"Oh,
Maybe
we can come back and spend an hour talking about gender."
I think we can do that.
That would be great. And then we don't, Dalton and I don't have to be sending heated texts to each other arguing about libertarianism.
Okay. Okay. So that sounds like a plan.
Thanks, Cathy.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you, Cathy.
Okay, I'm stopping the recording.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Professor and the Idiot. If you like what you heard, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a good rating so that others may find us and we can expand our social media juggernaut. And if you didn't like it, fuck off to the place you came from.